Today we're talking the Tory leadership and asking the question, who's going to be the next Tory leader? That might sound like a bit of a premature question, but there's a really interesting poll of Conservative Party members, activists, on ConHome today. And I'm joined to discuss that by Tim Montgomerie, a key member of the Reaction team and, of course, founder of Conservative Home. And we're going to kick this around a bit. The question, which is the number which is really grabbing people, Tim, is the plummeting score for Boris Johnson. I think he's down 35.7% in terms of the satisfaction ratings where they rank how the cabinet are doing. That's quite a fall.
Yeah, it's quite a fall. And you kindly mentioned, Iain, that I was founder of ConservativeHome. One of the very first things that I did with Stephen Shakespeare, who helped fund the site in its early days, and many people know him as the founder of the YouGov polling organization, we established these regular opinion polls. And if anyone's sort of doubting, whether they're accurate, again and again, when this poll has been tested, whether it's a Tory leadership race or the selection of Tory candidate for London mayor, it's been proved to be pretty accurate. Not perfect, but pretty accurate. So one thing that used to happen was that Tory HQ and that, when they didn't like the results, used to dismiss it. But actually, it's a really good indicator of what Tory opinion's at. And so this 36% decline in the support for Boris Johnson, I would say, is real. It may be 30%, it may be 50%, but it's certainly of that order. And that's a dramatic decline. And I don't know whether it's the confusion over travel guidance. I don't know whether it was that Sunday morning where, first of all, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor weren't going to self-isolate after Sajid Javid was infected, but then had to, just showing that they might have been out of touch with public opinion. I don't know whether it's the controversy over vaccine passports, whether it's the sort of result of things like Chesham and Amersham beginning to filter through into Conservative activists' mind. But overall, I just think there's this sense amongst the Tory grassroots that there really is something wrong in Downing Street. And this, it's a bit like a by-election. It's partly why Stefan and I initially set up this opinion poll. The grassroots were never listened to before. You'd occasionally get a Radio 4 person, go down to the Guildford Conservative Association and talk to 3 or 4 people. But we wanted to use these polls to send electric messages when necessary, just to give the grassroots a voice in the party. And I think they are saying to Number 10, and I hope they take heed, your performance isn't good enough. And we will see whether we see any change of course.
And that poll always consistently, when it was fashionable, and I plead guilty on this front, when it was fashionable among commentators at Westminster to say that Boris Johnson was, if not finished, was languishing, various periods, before 2016. After the Foreign Secretary spell, and Boris was written off. But actually, he was always, as you know from the events you used to organise at Tory conference, a huge draw with Conservative activists. You could almost take as for granted the fact that the Tories saw him as Tory activists saw him as an optimist, not all of them, but saw him as an optimistic figure and a winner. Mm. I wonder to what extent, though, is this part of a process by which the Conservative Party is notoriously ruthless, in which maybe his work is done. Mm. Now, this could be very premature. Maybe he goes on being Prime Minister for another 5 or 6 years with another general election win in the middle of it. Anything is possible. But he has been in the front line, a big figure in British politics, and very popular among Tories now for a long time, going back more than 10 years, or 15 years or so. And maybe just things change and tastes change, and it's a case of your work is done here.
Yeah. Well, even when, we used to get massive attendances at those rallies at Tory conference, but a lot of the people came, of course, because he was an entertainer. They weren't necessarily approving him as a possible leader. What changed? And I think, there was always those, do you remember the wisdom amongst a lot of commentators was that MPs would never vote for Boris Johnson as leader. But what changed, of course, was that the Theresa May premiership basically just ground into a nightmarish position of paralysis. The Brexit party broke through. The Tory parties couldn't seem to get Brexit done. The Tory vote had deserted them almost completely in the European elections. And Boris was always a roll of the dice. But they were willing to take the roll of the dice because things were so dire. And then, of course, he won a majority of 80, defeated Corbyn. Brexit's been done. And so he has, the roll of the dice was worth it in terms of those two things alone, if nothing else happened. But now we're getting into the real slog of governing, and all those doubts that Tory MPs have had about Boris's capabilities, I'm afraid are coming true. He hasn't built a team around him of sufficient quality, that he kind of thing that he had at a lower level of London mayor to compensate for his lack of attention to detail. And I can't see Labour winning the next election simply because of the problems they have in Scotland, not least. But I can see the Tories losing the election now. And I suspect that's partly what's motivating, this drop in approval from Tory members.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Labour has huge problems itself. I wrote at the weekend in my reaction subscriber newsletter about this question of why is Labour, I mean, we're now effectively in midterm after a pandemic which has turned the economy and society upside down, and Labour is excited to just be within reach of the Tories, and the Tories lead in poll after poll. So even though the gap has closed, and even that most recent piece of YouGov polling, which showed the Tories falling in southern seats by a substantial chunk, still miles and miles ahead of Labour, and Labour only going up by 4% in that poll. That was the YouGov polling on Saturday. So there's no sense yet of Labour having definitively broken through. You need a run of 6 months or so where Labour is consistently ahead in the polls. It's not happening yet, but I do wonder whether just even the closing of the gap suggests to Tory members and Tory activists that something about his magic has worn off. Now, on the other members of the cabinet who score very highly, of course, Liz Truss always consistently comes very high in these polls. Tory activists like her. I think, is that because she's perceived to be a Thatcherite? Is that what it's about?
I think she stands out simply because she's a woman. That's not, a factor to be ignored. I think they like her trade deals. I think they like the robust position she's taken on transgender issues, for example, and on equality stuff generally. I would mark her highly for that latter stuff. I'm not convinced by her success and trade deals. She certainly has been, she's got some results, and I think we're on the verge of getting a trade agreement with New Zealand following the one we've got with Australia. But people who I talk to who are in the know aren't convinced that we've got the Australia deal is that good, that we didn't negotiate particularly well. And that was always a criticism of her when she was chief secretary as well. She was good at the headline stuff, but didn't necessarily do the details. So I like Liz. She's good company. She's an effective minister in many ways, but I wouldn't rate her as highly as the average Tory member does, I'm afraid.
And there was, in that Australian trade deal, there was behind the scenes quite a lot had to be smoothed over, shall we say, in the way in which the Australians perceived that Truss's team had briefed against them in a rather aggressive way. That didn't suggest that they were treating the Australians like allies who are and must be respected. Then Rishi Sunak comes second, 74%. Dominic Raab, 71%. Sajid Javid, newly returned to the cabinet, 66%. And then Boris right down on 3.5%. Now, how does that translate, do you think, Tim, into this concept of a leadership race? There will be supporters of Boris Johnson in the Tory parliamentary party who say, listening to this, who say it's completely ridiculous. He's got a majority of 80. Yes, there are some rebellions. Governments always have, always have turmoil midterm. He's still ahead in the polls. Labour hasn't really made an advance. He's well placed to win the next general election. So all of this is 5-6 years premature. But things can change. Things can change quite quickly. And I've always had a sense with Boris Johnson that if he does go behind consistently in the polls, he's not. The danger for him is going to be is that the Tory party, in the way that you described, chose him out of, it was really sort of ruthless determination to try and blast its way out of the situation it had found itself in under Theresa May, and it was almost using Boris Johnson as much as Boris Johnson was using the Conservative Party as a vehicle. Yeah. But in the Tory in the ConHome leadership stakes, then, so I think Sunak is the clear winner. It's Sunak gets the largest number. Truss, Penny Mordaunt, Dominic Raab, and Sajid Javid. So there are probably some other names you would add into that as well. If it did end up in a leadership contest, so if Boris was run over by an electric-powered bus or something went wrong, or he did have to
with Dominic Cummings at the wheel. I'd check he had an alibi if he was run over by a bus.
Well, interestingly, Charles Moore wrote about this recently, that a lot of mockery of Boris Johnson in terms of, because of the Cummings situation, with Cummings out to get him, but actually, really, it's Boris who's still in number 10. And it's Cummings who's outside writing, Substack newsletter and getting more and more annoyed. So let's assume that all of those 5 would run: Sunak, Truss, Mordaunt, Raab, Sajid Javid. Are there any other names that you would throw in? I would say keep an eye on Kwasi Kwarteng as well.
What about Jeremy? Else? What about Jeremy Hunt, Iain? Would you put Jeremy? Of course, was defeated by Boris in the last election, but of course, it's not members, first of all, who vote. It's Tory MPs. And I would have thought that Jeremy Hunt still has quite a bit of residual support from MPs. And I'd be very surprised if he didn't at least throw his hat in the ring.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he saw his defeat last time as he learned a lot on the leadership campaign trail, and saw it as in terms of not having won this time. And you'd have to say that he's handled the aftermath of losing really very effectively, because he hasn't been sucked into Boris's orbit. He's doing his own thing with the health, running the health committee. And yes, I think he would be very well placed. But it depends on the circumstances in which Boris departed. If it was on the back of a scandal or a disaster, and perish the thought that such a thing could ever happen. But if it was a scandal or a disaster, and the Tories were looking for someone who was, technocratic is the wrong word, but was regarded as competent and experienced, and not tainted and associated with the ancien regime, then yes, he would have quite a powerful pitch, I think, of presenting himself as a clean start, but with someone experienced. And then, of course, I mean, Sunak, and Paul Goodman makes the point in his piece in the Times this morning about these membership surveys on ConHome, that Sunak is, of course, untested.
Yep.
And he's popular. He's dispensing a lot of money at the moment. Though I wondered, would you sense, though, Tim, that would you guess that Tory members are aware that he is also trying to fight off some of Boris's inclinations on ever higher spending as well? Does he get marks for that?
I think so. I think he's mainly. I think he would probably. It's not something I agree with, but I suspect the average Tory member was quite pleased with his battle on the aid budget as well. He's probably sort of getting something of a reputation for guarding the public money, the taxpayers' corner, in a way that the Prime Minister doesn't have. I think there are allegations, we don't know, but there was this story a couple of weeks ago that Sajid Javid and Boris Johnson wanted a hike in national insurance to pay for long-term care. And the sort of suggestion is that people in and around the Treasury, let's go no more than that, might have briefed this plan out because they wanted to kill it. And I expect that's where, Rishi Sunak's people probably want to portray him in the leadership race as the guy who wants to keep the tax burden down. But if I was Jeremy Hunt, I would definitely want this leadership race in a year or two, because in a year or two, that might be a lot harder position for Rishi Sunak to maintain. The public finances are in for a real challenging time. Debt repayments going up, the need to clear the backlog in various ways from the pandemic. It may be harder for Rishi Sunak to look like he's the taxpayer's friend at the end of that. The same sort of issues will cloud perhaps Sajid Javid's reputation. He's probably going to have to take some really tough decisions on the National Health Service. And you could see a scenario where the Tory party does what it's kept doing recently, choosing someone from slightly outside of the current setup to almost present like the government's a new thing. The new prime minister is a new thing leading a new government. It'll be much harder the more months go by for Sunak or Sajid Javid or Liz Truss even to present themselves as that. That's why I was also quite interested to see Penny Mordaunt quite high in the ratings. Not one of the most. She's on the front bench, but she's not really in the front line of government. And I think people who look like they're coming slightly from the outside, again and again, this is what the Tory party does. I'd watch any of those characters in any future leadership race.
You make a very good point there on the economics and tax rises, because this is not, if you think of the conventional electoral cycle, because of the shock that the pandemic has produced and all of that extra spending, it means that going in midterm and coming out of midterm, the argument is going to be which taxes rise and to what extent do they rise to theoretically pay the pandemic bill. And that's not an ideal setup for a general election campaign. But I suppose the calculation then will be in the Treasury and in number 10, and none of us know the answer. It's just to what extent does the fact that the economy is going gangbusters and is recovering very fast, to what extent does that mean that Sunak has, and the government in general has, greater scope to avoid clobbering the economy with tax rises that are bigger than needs to be? There will be parts of the Treasury that will be wanting the government to face up as soon as possible to the need for big tax rises, and there'll be a part of the government machine saying, look, let's wait and see. That's unknowable. That, I think, is going to be the story of September, October through to next spring. Very big choices which will then have a political impact. Just on the final question.
Can I interrupt you? Can I just what's your general sense, Iain, of, I sort of think we've probably got 8, 12, 18 months at most of really sort of good economic times. And then I think things will come down. We may have quite a bit of inflation in the system. I know Maggie, one of our colleagues, is less pessimistic than certainly me. I think that's new as well. But how far away are we from an unavoidable crunch, do you think, economically?
I've never known a time where policymakers, central bankers, economists who I respect are more confused and open about being confused about the picture and simply don't know. I mean, so much of what history tells us about economics and money supply would suggest that huge problems are being stoked up, and it's most apparent there in the housing market. You see the big survey on what's happening globally published in the FT today and elsewhere, and that's obviously a cause for concern. But then, as occasional reaction contributor and subscriber George Trefgarn always says, the mainstream economists have undersold the strength of the recovery. I mean, it really is. It's really bouncing back in a way which, in a style which people didn't quite expect. But yeah, the picture that you paint there is potentially very difficult for the Tories, because if it is that time frame, 18 months, and you add in some tax increases along the way, that's not really, that's in terms of going to the country, that takes you into 23, early election, 23, 24. The Tories cannot guarantee that they'll be going back to the country with the economy ticking over nicely. Of course, Boris just says, "Oh, don't worry about all of that. It'll kind of take care of itself." I was just going to ask you though on what the time frame is. Do you think, because Boris, having been laid low during the pandemic, and when lots of people said, a bit like we used to say, he might not be Tory leader, used to say, well, he may not even fight the next general election. He's so scarred by the whole thing, and he needs to get out of government and earn money. But he does seem determined now, as all prime ministers get hooked on, as we've discussed before, the concept of legacy and going on and on and on and beating the record of their predecessor, and why not? So it becomes a fixation. What is the time frame realistically, do you think? Is it is all of this completely academic until 2027, 28, and Boris just sails on, or if the government gets into serious economic difficulty, would the Tory tribe remove him?
I really don't know, and I think, going back to the poll that we began with, I think, on the face of it, you've got as many Tory members dissatisfied with Boris Johnson as satisfied, but that is very much on the face of it. You think of by-election electorates as sophisticated. When they vote in by-elections, they know they're not choosing a government. They're sending a signal, often in by-elections, that they want the government to improve or whatever. And I suspect that's what Tory members are doing at the moment. They know how this poll is reported. They know how it's used in the media. And at the moment, they're registering a protest vote. So I wouldn't be panicky at all if I was still an advisor to Boris Johnson in Downing Street. I would see this exactly as it is, as a warning shot. But yeah, the sort of circumstances you mentioned, particularly an economic slowdown, I think, Boris Johnson's Downing Street keeps making mistakes. It keeps mishandling certain aspects of the pandemic. Really, in a way, it's only been the vaccine that they've been particularly good at during this whole pandemic. A very good, significant thing they've been good at, but not much else. I think if they don't sort out their sort of dysfunctionality for when that economic slowdown comes, and I do think an economic slowdown is 18 months away, and I hope George Sethgarn and other optimists are right and I'm wrong, but they've got the time to fix the machine. If they don't fix it for when either that shock or another shock comes, I think Boris's premiership could end a lot earlier than the sort of the consensus was that he could go on for another 4, 5, 6 years. He's got 18 months, I think, to really fix his machine. That's the big thing. We know he's a vote winner. We know he's got charisma. We just don't know whether he can run a competent government. And if he doesn't sort that, that's his underlying vulnerability. And that's what Tory members, I think, are saying to him. Sort it now, otherwise you will be in trouble.
Also, we don't know the extent to which the joke, the routine, sometimes these routines are funny and are popular just until they're not.
They're not, yeah.
And there's a shift. I mean, this will be baffling to people who can't stand Boris Johnson and are appalled that he's prime minister in the first place and didn't think that it would happen. But if you try to understand it clinically and understand his appeal, his charisma to a certain kind of voter, and the way in which he has, his political genius, really, in a way, the way in which he has played with the rules of the game and consistently sort of mocked, the media's pretensions, and it is an act. It's a very, very clever act, and lots of voters who voted for him like the fact that he plays with the minds of the media and is not the classic fit for a prime minister. But it's not guaranteed that just endures forever. Eventually, just someone's great strength often turns into a weakness eventually. Yeah. Thatcher's stubbornness and determination eventually morphed until a point where even her former supporters, many of them, thought, well, enough is enough, and that point will presumably come at some point with Boris Johnson. I suspect we're going to be talking a lot more about this in the weeks, months, and years ahead. But if you're not a Reaction subscriber on YouTube, you just hit the button subscribe below, and also please like this video. And if you want to subscribe to Reaction, the main site where you get my weekly newsletter and all of the brilliant journalism by the team, go to the site and become a subscriber. There's a